To the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Pursuant to the order of reference on Tuesday, February 16th, we are now studying Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and to make related and consequential amendments to other acts. I'd like to remind everyone we are in a hybrid format still. We are all online by the looks of things, with the exception of myself. And I would remind everyone that you are not allowed to take pictures or snaps of the screen for distribution. We ask you not to do that. Thank you so much. Now, this is the part where I normally say, welcome to the committee. But today I have to say welcome back. As you know, we were waylaid in the last meeting that we had, so we're holding this over because we missed out on the last day. So here we are, and we start again with our first three witnesses, as we did last time. From the Alliance des Producteurs Francophones du Canada, Caroline Pilon, who's the Executive Director. From the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, Kevin Desjardins, who's the President. And from the Independent Broadcast Group, we have Joel Fortune, who is the Legal Counsel, and Monsieur Luc Perrault, Strategic Advisor. Thank you so much. Again, as you know, we do the 5 minutes introduction, as was before, except this time we'll actually get to questions. We're going to start off with Madame Pilon for 5 minutes.
For 5 minutes, please. I want to begin by thanking the committee for having me back. Since I've already had the opportunity to make a presentation that's on the public record, I will just briefly summarize it today, highlighting in particular points that are critical to us. The original APFC submission put forward the following three fundamental principles. 1, the absolute need to end the current inequitable treatment that exempts online companies from any obligation to support the creation and distribution of Canadian content. 2, the imperative need to include provisions in the Act to give the Canadian broadcasting system as a whole a clear mandate to reflect the situation of official language minority communities, or OLMCs, and to encourage the production of programs by their members. And 3, the unavoidable importance of enshrining in the Act significant provisions aimed at strengthening the place of original French language programming within the Canadian broadcasting system. We have attached concrete proposals for the wording of sections and amendments to give effect to those proposals. One strong concept unites the principles we are presenting: culture, that which promotes our development, enhances our identity, and allows the expression of our language. It is this same great principle of the diversity of cultural expressions that should form the foundation of the Canadian broadcasting system and be at the heart of its policies. Since our first intervention, Minister Joly has tabled a white paper, which in the years to come could lead to a revision of the Official Languages Act. Some claim that this possible revision could be sufficient to ensure that the objective of our second principle is achieved. While the reform recognizes the importance of supporting the creation and dissemination of Francophone content and improving access to it, this objective must be enshrined in the reference legislation, which is the Broadcasting Act, so that it can be concretely translated into the regulations that the CRTC will put in place. And it must be written in the clearest possible terms to apply to the entire broadcasting system. Experience has shown us that, to date, the Official Languages Act has not forced the CRTC to put in place measures that have tangible impact on meeting the needs of OLMCs. The figures speak for themselves, since our market share remains at 4%, though we account for 14% of the country's Francophone population. During his appearance, the Minister of Heritage implied that the current wording of the Act has allowed the CRTC to adequately support the presence of original French language Canadian content in the broadcasting system. It is imperative to note that the original French language production referred to by the Minister is predominantly Quebec-based, and that the growth of this production has not necessarily been reflected elsewhere in the country. Also, this phenomenon is not solely attributable to CRTC decisions. It is largely due to Quebec's cultural policy, which for many years has encouraged the creation of French-language cultural products. Francophones in a minority setting do not benefit from equivalent support. This is why the Act must ensure the creation, production, presentation, and discoverability of original French-language programs across Canada. In your discussions with Canadian broadcasters, many have asked for very significant easing of their current obligations. This leads us to fear that the millions of additional dollars to come from online businesses would in fact be only substitute dollars. In other words, we fear that the whole exercise would be a zero-sum game. Licensed broadcasters will see their contribution to Canadian content funding reduced by the same amount as the contributions from digital companies. The minister and Canadian Heritage officials made it clear that that is not the intention of the bill, but it is clear to us that there is nothing in the text of the Act itself that indicates or guarantees it. This is a concern for us. That is why we believe it is necessary to find a way to include in the preamble of the Act or in the other directives to the CRTC that the objective is clearly to increase the overall resources available to fund the creation and production of high-quality Canadian content and ensure its promotion and dissemination. In closing, we welcome the introduction of Bill C-10 and encourage the government to pass it as soon as possible. This great bill is unifying and is an exceptional opportunity to give a voice to all Canadians in the country. Thank you for your attention, and I would be pleased to answer your questions.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, ma'am.
We go to the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. Mr. Desjardins, for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee members. It is a pleasure to be back again today to speak on this important piece of legislation.
President of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. The CAB is the national voice of Canada's private broadcasters, representing the vast majority of private radio and television operators in communities large and small and in both official languages. For nearly 100 years, Canada's private broadcasters have been a part of the cultural and economic fabric of the nation. They've provided a platform for Canadian stories, invested in Canadian talent, employed Canadian workers,
Mr. Desjardins?
Mr. Desjardins?
My apologies. It appears we're not getting French interpretation. We're not getting the interpretation for that. We are? Okay. Sorry. We're okay now? Okay. My apologies. Yes. Sorry, we had a few blips there. I apologize. Your clock was stopped. You can proceed now. Again, our apologies. Mr. Desjardins, please proceed.
No problem. Thanks. So for nearly 100 years, Canadian private broadcasters have been a part of the cultural and economic fabric of the nation. They've provided a platform for Canadian stories, invested in Canadian talent, employed Canadian workers, reflected Canadian diversity, paid Canadian taxes, entertained Canadian audiences, and informed Canadian citizens. The legislation we are here to study comes at a critical moment for our sector. Over the past decade, the competitive landscape for Canada's broadcasters has fundamentally changed. Unregulated digital competitors have moved into the Canadian market without a hindrance or oversight. They have fragmented audiences, driven down revenues, and driven up programming costs. In short, they have turned traditional broadcasting business models on their heads. The advertising marketplace has changed radically, with online platforms now consuming half of those advertising dollars. In fact, private conventional TV stations posted negative margin of 7% in 2019, the seventh consecutive year of losses, and that was before COVID-19. Similarly, nearly as many Canadian viewers are watching internet streaming services as watch television through cable or satellite providers. In addition to decreasing audiences and subscriptions, these new over-the-top entrants have fundamentally changed consumer behavior. These structural challenges require structural solutions. Broadcasters are doing their part, investing in new content and technologies, following audiences onto new platforms. However, they remain hindered by unsustainable and inequitable regulatory obligations. And this is why we welcome Bill C-10. The Broadcasting Act is 30 years old, and it still presumes a reality for the sector that has long since become a remnant of history. It assumes that there are limited ways for content to reach Canadians, and as such as was the case when Canadians can only watch or listen to programs over the public airwaves. Because licenses to operate broadcasting channels over those airwaves were scarce, they were highly valuable. Broadcasters' regulatory obligations, especially with respect to Canadian content, were proportionally high. Today, because audiences have a multitude of content platform options, the value of traditional broadcasting licenses is much less than it once was. Nevertheless, regulatory obligations have remained as onerous as ever, and in some cases have become more burdensome. So this has left Canadian broadcasters as some of the most heavily regulated businesses in Canada, attempting to compete in one of the most profoundly disrupted industries in the world. These trends have created an existential crisis. A study published last year estimates that television and radio broadcasters stood to lose more than $1 billion in revenues between 2020 and 2022. Canada's private broadcasters are not interested in turning back the clock. They're optimistic about the future, and they want to continue evolving with Canadians, providing cultural and economic value to the nation. However, they cannot continue to shoulder their significant obligations alone. Bringing digital broadcasters into the regulatory system is a necessary first step, which Bill C-10 gets right. But it is not enough to simply apply a parallel regime to extract additional dollars from digital giants. We need to rebalance obligations and create a modern, agile, sustainable regulatory framework that will allow Canadian broadcasters to adapt to the new realities. These changes are particularly vital for sustaining one of the most important public services that our domestic broadcasting industry continues to provide, local news. Canadian private broadcasters remain especially proud to be the primary source of news and information in communities across the country. In an era of misinformation and global pandemics, it is critical that we identify ways to continue to support local news voices that reflect the reality of their communities and reflect a fair and accurate vision of Canada back to Canadians. We know that the digital giants will have little interest in delivering the evening news from Lethbridge, Saskatoon, Peterborough, or Quebec City. Ultimately, Bill C-10 needs to support local news and help us find ways to ensure that these critical Canadian stories are funded across the country in markets large and small.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. I'm sorry, I have to leave it there. We're well over your 5 minutes. Now I'm going to turn to the Independent Broadcast Group. We have Monsieur Perrault and Mr. Fortune. By show of hand, who's going first? Monsieur Perrault, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Perrault, go ahead, please. You have...
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good day, Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to finish our appearance. I am Strategic Advisor for Stingray Group, which is a member of the Independent Broadcast Group, or IBG. With me is Joelle Fortune, Legal Counsel for IBG. IBG supports Bill C-10, but is asking that it be amended before being passed. The bill gives the CRTC the jurisdiction needed to oversee online programming services like Netflix that offer individual programs to subscribers. But the bill gives the CRTC important powers. However, it takes away the CRTC's jurisdiction to oversee online distribution services at a time when Canada's major cable companies are preparing to offer internet distribution services to accompany their established cable services. This lack of oversight also applies to global platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV, etc., which also offer distribution platforms that bundle applications and services provided by other companies, many of which offer program guides and linear content, such as Pluto TV. Currently, the CRTC has the power to ensure that Canadian services are treated fairly in these online environments. Bill C-10 eliminates this jurisdiction. The few changes that we have proposed will resolve this problem. Why is this regulatory authority so important? As independent broadcasters, we know how critical it is to have fair access to distribution platforms. I will leave it to my colleague Joelle to explain why the future of independent broadcasters and independent distributors depends on these amendments.
IBG recently completed a study that demonstrates some of the problems with Canada's existing broadcasting system. Between 2015 and 2019, some Canadians cut the cord and the base of Canadian subscribers fell by about 6.5%. IBG's study finds that over this same time period, the revenue of non-mandatory Canadian independent television discretionary services fell faster by 20%. Meanwhile, the revenue of the large vertically discretionary services actually rose. The collective per subscriber wholesale rate for these services increased by more than 20% over this same time period. This is more than twice the rate of inflation. These differences suggest strongly that the market power of Canada's large vertically integrated BDUs is distorting the Canadian market. This kind of discrepancy in revenue is not sustainable. It is undermining diversity in the Canadian system. We believe that the CRTC's rules in this area need attention, but at least the CRTC has the authority to do what is required. Under Bill C-10, they won't in an online environment. In an online environment, it's imperative that the CRTC have clear jurisdiction to ensure the fair treatment of all players, including in the ever-changing use of algorithms and in the fair use of data. We are not alone in our concerns. The Canadian Communication Systems Alliance, or CCSA, represents independent cable and IPTV companies. They're on one side of the independent broadcasting coin in Canada, and we are on the other. In its submission to you, the CCSA underlines the importance to this committee's work of the market power of Canada's own media giants. We support the CCSA's comments, which echo our own, and the changes the CCSA is proposing in addition to our own. CCSA suggests an amendment to new section 9.11F to add a reference to contracts between broadcasting undertakings. CCSA also proposes that the CRTC's authority to protect against undue preference and disadvantage in the distribution be brought into the bill. Both changes respond to the reality of the consolidated broadcasting industry in Canada. Lastly, just to follow up on some other points of discussion we've been following in this committee, on the question of Canadian ownership, of course, BC-10 should include Canadian ownership of all types of services as a policy objective. It should be updated, not removed as a policy. On the question of the role of Canadian broadcasters, we've heard words of support for Canadian broadcasters and the important role we play as the bedrock of the system. But the bill omits the most important issue for most broadcasters, fair access to the means of distribution. Thank you for the chance to appear. We'd be happy to answer your questions.
And thank you so much for that. We're going to go now to our questions. I'd like to remind my colleagues about addressing your question directly. You name the person, since we are all in a virtual format. That makes it much easier. We're going to go to the Conservatives for 6 minutes. I got that right? 6 minutes. Yes, indeed. Mr. Waugh, 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I welcome back all three groups as we had them earlier, and we were interrupted, I think, with votes at that time. Ms. Pilon, thank you for all your work and bringing forth the 6 amendments that your organization would like to see. I think we have all heard the concern of your organization and your province and those outside of Quebec that speak French and want French culture. Could you just speak to that? Because there seems to be a concern with OLMCs in this, and you at least have provided 6 very good amendments that your organization would like to see included in this bill.
The Canadian Francophone Producers Alliance represents members outside of Quebec. So our members are in the West, in the East, in Ontario, in the territories. And today, the production volume that is produced by independent producers outside of Quebec fluctuates around 4%. Ms. Pilon?
Thanks for interrupting, sincerely. Can you move the microphone, I guess, a little bit further away? There's a lot of popping on your microphone. This is for the sake of our translators. Thank you so much. Interpreters, sorry. All right. Sorry to interrupt your question and answer. I hope you can pick up where you left off. Thank you.
Est-ce que c'est mieux? Ça va mieux? Donc, en effet, nos producteurs travaillent à l'extérieur du Québec et en ce moment, le volume de production indépendant à l'extérieur du Québec vacille autour de 4% malgré le fait que la population francophone à l'extérieur
Oh,
du Québec.
sorry, Madame Pilon. I apologize again. You have to bring it down a little bit further. Now we can't hear you. I might be leading you madly off in different directions on where your microphone should be, and I apologize. But do you want to give us a? I tell you what, let's just resume from there, and we'll do this as we go along. I apologize for interrupting your train of thought. Go ahead.
Ça va.
It's okay. So, the Francophone population outside of Quebec makes up 14% of the Francophone population in Canada. The Broadcasting Act, as it is now, has a vague or has a unique reference to linguistic duality, and that is the only provision in the current bill or in the current act that gives us a status. So it is very important to explicitly name official language minority communities to be able to ensure the content is protected and ensure access to that content for communities outside of Quebec. I would also say even though some stakeholders have said that the OLA gives OLMCs a certain status based on the Constitution, I would still say that only Radio-Canada has a mandate in the Broadcasting Act, OLMC obligations. The major private groups do not have that obligation, and the CRTC chooses its interpretation of linguistic duality in a vague way regarding private groups, and it gives them incentives, and it has given them incentives in the past, but they did not succeed in meeting needs for LMCs.
But thank you. We're going to move to Mr. Desjardins. I noticed the CAB is getting smaller, it seems, each year. You know, it's listed here, you got 401 radio stations and 78 TV stations behind you. But each and every one of those organizations, when we have spoken to them, feel that the CRTC is heavily regulated. And this is an issue going forward with this bill. The CRTC will have full control, but the regulation right now in your sector, especially for the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, we have heard loud and clear, it's too regulated right now. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think absolutely we would say, that we don't see C10 as an opportunity to find new rules and new regulations to impose on our domestic private broadcasters. As I say, we do feel that there are an abundance of obligations and requirements that are already there, reporting requirements. There is certainly a long list of these that apply to private broadcasters already. And I don't think that we see anything within the bill that is going to create those obligations and those requirements onto the online streamers. So I don't think that this is a time for us to come and to look at it as an opportunity to extract more value from the private broadcasters, especially at a time when, as I said at the outset, that our business is really being challenged on all sides of our value chain. We are sharing the audience with these international players who have walked in unfettered into the market. So obviously, I think that for us, if anything, we would hope that there would be an ability to create a lighter regulatory framework for Canada's private broadcasters and not find a number of new obligations and rules for them.
Thank you. I'll move to the Independent Broadcasters Group. Gentlemen, certain terms such as terms of service, discoverability, and social media are not defined in this bill. Should they be? Mr. Perot or Mr. Fortune?
maybe I'll take that, Luke. There's a lot that isn't defined in the bill. And to my view, these are terms just like internet isn't necessarily defined in the bill. These are terms that are generally understood and can be given meaning when the act is interpreted in its normal course, like terms of service, for example. I think if you're talking about terms of service between broadcasting undertakings, I think those are the terms that are negotiated by broadcasting undertakings. If you're talking terms of service to consumers, similarly, it's the contractual terms offered to consumers. So, I mean, we can get tied up on all kinds of definitional issues, but and there's a few extremely important definitions in the Act. And those are the ones that deal with online undertaking, programming undertaking, distribution undertaking, and network.
Okay,
and
thank.
support those.
Sorry, Mr. Fortune, I have to stop it right there. Mr. Housefather, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to all of the witnesses for coming back again today and finally getting a chance to do your full presentations. I am going to concentrate my questions with Madame Pilon as a member of the committee who comes from an official language minority community and who cares very much about this issue. It is one of the things that I believe most needs amendment in this law is the recognition of the place of official language minority communities in Canada within the bill. In Quebec, as we know from previous testimony, we used to have more than 25% of the original English content in Canada created in Quebec. Now it is less than 7%. And
in the rest of the country, we only have 4% of Francophone content that coming from Francophone minorities outside of Quebec, and I don't think that's enough. We need to find a way not only to ensure the prosperity of the creation and diffusion of original French language programming everywhere in Canada, not just in Quebec, but also find a way to recognize OLMCs outside of Quebec and the Anglophone community in Quebec. So, Ms. Pilon, what would be the real consequences of not explicitly naming OLMCs in the Act? I'm sure that you heard me ask that question to Minister Guilbeault, and he said that the CRTC regulations will guarantee that sort of thing. But in my opinion, it would be preferable to explicitly state it in the bill. Do you agree? Yes, we fully agree. And in fact, what we propose is two principles. And these principles would ensure that protection. The first has to do with OLMCs. That includes Anglophones in Quebec, as well as Francophones outside of Quebec. And to include a section in Section 3 to specifically ensure the creation of content by and for OLMCs and guarantee access to that content. And we use words like ensure and guarantee, which are very clear and specific and imperative words. And the reason we use those is that in the past, regarding our communities and our hearings and with the CRTC, as I've often said, that linguistic duality was interpreted in a very vague sense. Because they can say that linguistic duality can be ensured when we offer French content in Quebec and English content in the rest of Canada. And it can also be argued that linguistic duality has already been protected, but OLMCs need to be named. And this is also part of our proposals for Bill C-10. And in Radio-Canada's mandate, we added a distance section that guaranteed a part of the contributions by Radio-Canada for production that had to be spent outside of Quebec. And the interpretation of that made it so that in the CRTC's report, Radio-Canada included Anglophone content in order to meet those requirements. All of this is to say that when we're not specific and when we don't name things, all sorts of interpretations can stem from that. This is why we are proponents of clear wording in the new bill, because our communities have value and we should be recognized as being part of the Canadian identity and the broadcasting reality. I entirely agree. And what impressed me is that you worked on your amendments, which are very specific. You worked not only with your organization outside of Quebec, but you also worked with the Anglophones in Quebec, the Quebec English Language Production Council, and you worked with Quebec broadcasters. So you really worked with all of the various groups to try and strike a balance in your amendments that will protect French everywhere in Canada and also OLMCs in Quebec as well as outside of Quebec. So I found that excellent. I have another question. You didn't raise this topic, but the CRTC, there will be a clause regarding contracting relations between the CRTC and broadcasting undertakings. What is your take on that? Well, I think that what exists between the CRTC and broadcasters, especially those part of our organization, is very imbalanced. These are small undertakings that still have difficulty carving out a place for themselves in broadcasting. The going is harder when the policies are in favor of certain groups. Positive results have been seen when positive policies support creators. Now we're seeing foreign players in the system, and we have less negotiating power. So we know that most of these companies are trying to get the biggest part of the rights, etc. Thank you, ma'am.
To move on. Pour 6 minutes, Monsieur.
For 6 minutes, Mr. Champoux. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's my turn to thank the witnesses for their patience and for coming back to see us today. Mr. Perrault, have you looked at the draft that the minister has sent to us of the directives to the CRTC? What is your take on that? Does it address your concerns? I would say it's a great start. The directives are relatively aligned with the discussions that we're having with the committee. However, when working with directives, sometimes it's preferable for certain elements to be included in the Act instead of just relying on directives. For example, foreign property. For example, amendments that we proposed to regulate the primacy of Canadian services or Canadian content on online platforms. So regarding the CRTC directive, the Supreme Court already told the CRTC when the CRTC was trying to set up certain taxes, the Supreme Court said that it was not included in the law, and therefore, so you're saying that things need to be included in the law and not just in the directives. Yes, exactly. Because governments come and go, so if the governor and council were to change, the CRTC would be less predictable in that sense. During your speech earlier, you said the CRTC now has certain jurisdiction, but that Bill C-10 would take away that jurisdiction. But I thought it was quite the opposite. Well, the CRTC is a regulator. So there's the Digital Media Exemption Order, and the CRTC chose not to regulate online services. It has the power to do it, but it exempted them. So the CRTC has and had the power, but Bill C-10 takes away all of those powers that the CRTC currently has regarding how it could regulate online undertakings. And still on Bill C-10, you were proposing, and you have a lot of hesitation because you and I had the chance to talk. Do you think that with no amendment, this bill should go ahead, or, in your opinion, should it be completely scrapped and start again at another time? How important is it to you that amendments be made? We consulted broadly before proposing our amendments. And I think that these amendments clarify the CRTC's authorities. And if those amendments are adopted, we have no problem with the bill. We think that the new Broadcasting Act will be sufficiently equitable, and the CRTC will have enough power to regulate online operations without always needing directors from the Governor and Council. When Mr. Fortune mentioned discoverability and presence of independent broadcasters in packages, I found it interesting. Could you talk about the vulnerability of independent broadcasters compared to other broadcasters? When the CRTC gave birth to the new regulations, there was a code of conduct that was written. And in that code of conduct, certain elements should be changed. Because every time that an independent broadcaster goes up against another entity, we don't have a lot of power. And our distribution rates always decrease. So the money extracted from distribution funds for independent broadcasters is problematic, and this should be reviewed by the CRTC. Certain parts of the Code of Conduct should be amended. Thank you. I perhaps have time to ask one more question quickly, a question for Ms. Pilon. Earlier, Ms. Pilon, you spoke about flexibility in directives. You found that too much flexibility was given to CRTC. Can you talk about the consequences of that? Because that really spoke to me as well. Well, certainly that document should be studied in detail, but at first glance, when I first read it, that is what hit me. That, for example, if it is flexibility, that means that there's no growth in investment to support for Canadian content. I think that we're missing the mark. We're missing the objective, absolutely. And I think that in some way we need to indicate that this is a bill. Thank you, Ms. Pilon.
Again, I seem to be cutting you off again. Madame McPherson, pour 6 minutes.
For 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to all the witnesses for being with us, for joining us again. I would like to just allow Ms. Pilon to finish her thought if I could. I know she got interrupted.
Thank you very much. En effet, si...
Yes. It needs to be enshrined somewhere, either in the preamble or clearly in the directives, that what we want to do is increase the support for production and for distribution of Canadian content. It needs to be clear. Because as Mr. Perrault has already said, we could be at the mercy of different directives that could be sent by the governor and council when governments come and go. So ideally, it would be in the preamble of the act that it would be clearly enshrined, and that would be revised there.
Of course, I come from Edmonton, Strathcona, and we are a francophone. We have a massive francophone population, so I have deep concerns about what is going to be happening to make sure that official languages outside of official minority languages are protected language rights. I'm going to ask a few questions, actually, if I could, of the Independent Broadcasters Group now. You probably were watching on Monday when we had the minister join us, and I did ask the minister if C10 would guarantee that Canadian broadcasters could not be bought by foreign companies. How do you feel about that? Why do we need to see a provision in the bill to protect our Canadian broadcasters? What could you discuss that a little bit, Mr. Perot or Mr. Fortune?
Well, first of all, I mean, all IBG members agree that Canadian ownership has to be part of the law. It can be achieved via directive. I will let Joel, I mean, I've known Joel for 25 years. He's one of the greatest lawyers in the world of broadcast law. And I will let Joel explain why it should be part of the law and not managed by a GIC directives.
Well, thanks, Luke, for that. The way the law works generally is it's got two major parts. You have the policy objectives set out in Section 3, and then you have the powers. And you have to have both elements. You have to have a policy objective and you have to have a power. One, you can have all the noble policy objectives in the world, and if there's no power to back it up, it doesn't help. Similarly, all the powers in the world, if there's no object in the act, it can easily be challenged. So in the case of ownership, firstly on the policy level, it would be incredible to me if we didn't have Canadian ownership, the support of Canadian ownership in our system as an objective. This is not to say the ownership language shouldn't be amended. Perhaps it should be, but we proposed an amendment that I think takes into account global platforms while also preserving the space for Canadian broadcasters. And why do we want that? Well, we don't want Canadian broadcasters just to be branch plants of foreign platforms. I mean, I'd refer this committee to the excellent Lincoln report from 2003, where they said exactly that. The best way, the best interest of Canadian citizens and fostering our own talents and imaginations cannot be left to foreign interests, period. Now, legally, the direction exists under the existing act, which includes a requirement that the broadcasting system will be effectively owned and controlled by Canadians. So that policy direction speaks directly to that object. If you have no object about Canadian ownership, what's the authority for making that direction? I think it's certainly open for the direction to be challenged at law that it's no longer valid given the change in the policy in the act. So that's the concern there.
Okay. Yeah, and so I'd like to see that strengthened, certainly. I'm going to ask, with my remaining time, I'm going to ask Mr. Desjardins a question as well. One of your member companies, Chorus, in their testimony to this committee said that producers are making record profits while broadcasters are suffering, and that was the reason why they want to loosen CanCon obligations. But in their last quarter, Chorus recorded a 45% profit margin. So how do we square these two things? How do we make these two things align?
Well, I think that I can't speak exactly to the last quarter or whatnot. I do know that effectively over the last 7 years that broadcasting writ large has been losing money. Certainly on the TV side, we've seen the independent producers have basically seen about 7 years of growth, and we've seen 7 years of decline. In terms of all that goes into that quarterly report, I can't speak exactly to that, but I can tell you that even before COVID, there were really substantial challenges. And again, as I say, it's a combination of things. It's losing subscribers to cord cutters. It's losing advertisers to online advertising, and it's losing viewers to other groups. And just in terms of this. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. My apologies. Folks, we do have time for a second round. That will put me a couple minutes over the top of the hour, but certainly it's worth achieving. So let's go to Mr. Shields. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fortune, you were giving a good legal statement on policy, but the consequences you didn't get to in a sense. You referred to the Lincoln study. So if this doesn't happen, what do you believe the consequences will be?
So what are the consequences if the bill does not include a Canadian ownership as a policy objective, is your question?
Yes.
Well, firstly, I would say on a policy level, any policy, any regulation, service order, anything of that nature that sought to encourage Canadian ownership of our own services for that reason would be suspect. Essentially, it takes away a whole area of jurisdiction and carving out space in our own system for Canadian services. So that's sort of the big question there. Now, in terms of the existing ownership direction, I mean, it's not going to disappear instantaneously when the Act comes into place, but it does raise a big question mark, is what is the authority for that ownership direction if Canadian ownership is not even included as a policy objective in the Act?
And the result would be, I'm looking for the next step, the result.
Okay. Sorry. Well, if the government were taken to court on the VRES of its ownership direction and it were struck down, there would be no ownership restrictions in Canadian broadcast.
And the result would be? What do you think?
Well, the markets, I guess the result would be we'd see a hollowing out of Canadian ownership of broadcasting services, sales to foreign entities.
That's where I wanted to go. Get to the conclusion of what the result would be if it isn't there.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you. To Mr. Desjardins, in the sense when you talked about a 50% loss in ad revenue, so you said it's gone to the internet services, it's gone to different places?
Yeah, so effectively within the last decade, it's been a really dramatic change in terms of what the advertising landscape looks like in Canada, and 50% of it now is going to online services. So that's that's a whole new competitor, and I would say that 80% of the online advertising that's done in Canada is done through Facebook and Google. So
why is it gone there?
I mean, they are really the two giants of the online.
Got that, but why did it go there?
I mean, I think that they have scale, an ability to be able to take advertising and to distribute it. They're certainly much larger. They're able to undercut the prices of even, say, Canadian. If a Canadian company were to try to get into this area, they would be able to, by virtue of the fact that they are globally capitalized. And this goes to the last question here, as we were talking about this idea of Canadian ownership. I just think that one of the things that we keep talking about in this discussion is creating a less and less equitable broadcasting system between Canadian operators and international operators. And international operators have vast access to capital markets around the world. And if we want to say, well, they can do that, and Canadian operators they can only bring in.
I got one other question though, and I got to
Sure.
get to you. You mentioned that the behavior is changed of the subscriber, the clients, the customers. The behavior's changed. What in this bill will change that behavior back?
Well, I don't think that it's attempting to change the behavior. I think it's attempting to recognize the behavior, and I think that part of the problem that we have is that the Broadcasting Act is still looking at broadcasting as it was in 1992 and not as it is in 2021, and it's very much to the detriment of our Canadian broadcasters, and that's just the last thing that I would plead with both this committee and the government is, the Broadcasting Act is fundamentally the law that by which broadcasters operate. And, there's lots of people who have an interest, but this is, we're committed to this. And so to keep broadcasters and their future ability to compete at the center of the considerations going forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Madame Bessette.
Ms. Bissett, for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses to be back with us today. I'll start with Mr. Desjardins. The Broadcasting Act is essentially the same as it was in 1990. The committee has often heard from its witnesses that its modernization is absolutely essential and even urgent for the health of our cultural industry. Do you agree? And do you think that the modernization needs to be done urgently?
Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Bissett, for the question. I would say absolutely. It has been too long since the Broadcasting Act was behind the reality we're currently experiencing. Just as I said to Mr. Shields, viewers are changing, and it is very pressing to move forward with this legislation. Because if it doesn't get through now, it could be a year or 2 years before we come back to it. And it has an impact on the reality of broadcasting in 2023 or 2024. So we at least need to push to make sure that we address what happened over the past decade. Thank you very much. I would like to put the same question to the Independent Broadcasters Group. Do you agree that the bill must be modernized immediately? And what would be the effect on the broadcasters you represent if it did not pass? Well, I think it's very important for us to move forward with this bill, because certainly in 5 years, if global platforms really still are the universal way that all Canadians access content, we'll have a serious problem, because those huge global platforms obviously don't pay tax in Canada. So there's no tax benefit to Canada for the income they're making. And then they would be having their word in our cultural sovereignty. They use algorithms to direct Canadians towards certain applications and certain content, and those algorithms are created abroad. They don't have Canada's interests at heart. Therefore, it's important to begin supervising that ecosystem. This will ensure the discoverability of Canadian content. It will ensure that Canadians have access to Canadian content. And those decisions will not be made by foreign companies. Let's take the example of Stingray. For Stingray, it's very difficult to have access to global platforms because it signed agreements with Spotify. And these decisions are made outside of Canada. So Canadian broadcasters will all suffer if we are not able to supervise the major giants in the ecosystem. Thank you. I don't have much time left, but I do have another question for you. There was a concentration of property for a few major broadcasters, but there are also small players, and your part of the market is decreasing. Can you talk about the importance of the diversity of representation in the cultural industry? Yes. Diversity also means the diversity of property. As you say, we've seen that in Canada, that diversity for TV broadcasters in general, are shared by a small number of major groups. I would like to take the example of Out TV, which represents the LGBTQ plus community and signed agreements in Australia and with Apple. There's also Pelmerex as an example that did weather in Canada, but also has dealings in Portugal, etc. These entrepreneurs not only created a solid corporation, they then moved on to 2 or 3 different countries outside of Canada. That's not what major companies do. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Shampoo.
Mr. Shampoo, you have 2 minutes, 30 seconds, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barrault, I'll come back to you because we've had a hard time for me asking you a question and you giving an answer in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So, my question, traditional broadcasters want relief in their obligations. Of course, the cultural industry wants to protect content as much as possible. Do you believe it's possible, in the short amount of time we have to work on this bill, to strike a balance that will meet everyone's expectations? Well, I think that if we all work together to ensure the discoverability of Canadian content, and if we all work together to try and serve our communities with the type of programming our communities want, then we can come up with something. Certainly, regulations about Canadian content might weigh heavily on certain distributors, but it's important for Canadian content. All of that can be regulated through the new contributions that online companies will make. If there are broadcasters that receive a lot of money to create content, well, there will also follow the obligation for those contributions. I would also like to come back to obligations on traditional broadcasters. What are the ones that aren't necessary? What are the ones that could be cut, that could be spared in this new digital environment? Well, I represent Stingray, so I'll give you that example. We have tangible income because of investments. At the same time, our radio stations lost 50% of their revenue. So the CRTC and the Broadcasting Act, rather, needs to have more flexibility to adapt to the circumstances. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Ms. McPherson, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think I will follow up on some of the comments that my colleague from the bloc has just been talking a little bit about. Mr. Desjardins, I'm hearing that broadcasters are not only wanting to bring streamers into the tent, but that also want to reduce their own commitments. And of course, this concerns me as far as CanCon goes. I understand that the regulations that exist now are relatively flexible, meaning that your CanCon commitments are tied to your revenues and not just an arbitrary number. Does reducing CanCon obligations across the board concern you at all?
So I think that I would want to reframe that and to say that it's not about reducing CanCon. That's not what we've been talking about. I think it's about being more flexible about the sorts of CanCon that Canadian broadcasters can invest in. So right now there are fairly strict rules on, what sort of programs have to be supported, and who it is that broadcasters have to support. And I think that one of the things that that concerns me is that when you have a number of spending obligations on the one side, you have reductions in your advertising revenue on the other side. What ends up getting squeezed is the internal production that gets done by broadcasters, and that's news. And frankly, we don't talk about news as Canadian stories nearly enough, and that is the most essential Canadian story. It's in fact the thing that more Canadians turn to broadcasters for news than anywhere else, more than papers, more than anywhere else. And for us, I just think that allowing us to be able to reinvest internally into the broadcaster's own news and information programming is really what we would be looking for. It's not about reducing CanCon. I mean, that's absolutely a canard. It's about allowing broadcasters to invest in programming that they can that is their own, and not necessarily just have to spend externally.
And I'd love to ask the Independent Broadcasters Group as well, but I know I'm running short on time. Mr. Chair, do I have a moment?
I'm afraid you don't, ma'am. I really have to break because we're running behind. So thank you very much to our guests, Monsieur Perrault, Mr. Desjardins, and Madame Pilon. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you soon. Thank you again. Welcome back. Bienvenue encore. Welcome to the second round of today's meeting. We are, of course, discussing Bill C-10. And we go ahead again with testimony. We are running tight on time. I'm hoping to get 2 rounds in. I may ask for permission to cut down a little bit on the time in the second hour, or the second round, sorry. So please bear with me. We'll get to that a bit later. But in the meantime, I want to introduce our guests from the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. We have Nathalie Gay, who's Executive Director, Bill Skolnick, who's the co-chair. Motion Picture Association of Canada, we have Wendy Noss, who's president, and we have John Morgan Lewis from the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. Also, from Quebecor Media, we have Pierre-Carl Paladeau, President and Chief Executive Officer, and Peggy Tabé, who's the Vice President, Public and Regulatory Affairs. We're going to start with the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. If I can just get a hand up as to who's going to start. Mr. Skolnick, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee for inviting us here this afternoon. My name is Bill Skolnick. I'm the co-chair of the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. We are a coalition of 43 organizations representing more than 200,000 creators, performers, and professionals in trade associations, music and screen production, publishers, unions, and collectives. For more than 20 years, our members have been working together to protect and promote Canada's diverse cultural expressions. My colleague, Nathalie Gay, and I have been CSO delegates at several UNESCO assemblies on this topic. This crucial protection and promotion requires the exercise of cultural sovereignty. The review of the Broadcasting Act is an essential part of the toolkit that can return some balance to our ecosystem. It is worth noting that the maintenance of cultural diversity was deliberately included in the terms of reference for the Yale Commission. Recently, it was reported that 1 in 4 people working in this sector lost their jobs in 2020 due to the pandemic. Meanwhile, companies providing access to cultural expressions online have made substantial profits. Netflix's revenues have increased by more than 22% during 2020. It was a great year for Spotify, too. They saw their total subscriptions rise by 27%. The CDCE applauded the tabling of Bill C-10 on November 3rd, 2020, and we welcome the agreement of all parliamentarians to move the bill forward at an accelerated pace. To us, this represented agreement on the urgency to act. Many of the people who have appeared before you referred to our proposals to improve the bill. We have gone to the heart of the matter to ensure that the Broadcasting Act truly allows Canada to maintain cultural sovereignty. The changes that we ask you to contemplate are the result of an unprecedented consensus created by our multifaceted and eclectic membership. We will respond to the draft policy direction with the same objectives. The Broadcasting Act is not just for regulation, it's cultural policy, and it has to remain cultural policy. I will now turn the floor over to Natalie, who will present these proposals to you. Thanks.
Merci, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Hello, everyone. My name is Nathalie Gay. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. You received our 7 major requests to improve C10. I'll go over them. I'll be happy to receive your comments and questions. First, the bill must include distribution services provided by online companies, as was presented earlier today, and unambiguously include social media. We understand that the intent is to include social media, including its curation role, with respect to professional content, but we find the exclusions confusing, rather. Our approach allows for their inclusion from the outset, in particular so that the CRTC can make full use of its new powers to gather information from these companies and then let the CRTC determine if and how these companies should contribute to our ecosystems. Second, for our cultural sovereignty, our identity, and our social cohesion, the system must be under Canadian control. The much talked about CRTC directive does not apply to companies that do not require a license. The system can essentially be essentially Canadian despite the presence of some foreign companies. Third, the Act must continue to showcase Canadian talent. The proposed wording of Section 31F could remove any obligation on broadcasting undertakings to use Canadian talent, whereas the current wording already allows for the consideration of the nature of the service. Fourth, we believe that the scope for appeal to the Governor and Council should be expanded. C10 gives a lot of power to the CRTC. Let's ensure a better balance by allowing civil society organizations to file appeals to trigger a review of a CRTC decision. Fifth, stronger provisions are needed to ensure the creation of original French language content, and not just content that is translated or subtitled in French. Original French language programming from French-speaking minorities and programming in Aboriginal languages are also needed to reflect cultural diversity. Sixth, orders should have a maximum duration and should be amendable to allow broadcasters and producers to better plan their programming and production, but also to ensure that conditions are reviewed and that all stakeholders can be heard regarding a service. Seventh, a race to the bottom must be avoided. The proposed wording in 52A1, for example, opens the door to companies being able to compare themselves too easily with others to obtain less restrictive conditions. It may be more logical and beneficial to tailor spending requirements to specific companies rather than defining by regulation what may look like a minimum that applies to all. We also want to see a public hearing process for the issuance of orders. Finally, there are 2 other corrections worth being made. The CRTC must continue to decide on the proportion of programs devoted to certain genres. Otherwise, programs of national interest, such as children's programs, dramas, documentaries, might be neglected in favor of programs less costly to produce, such as sports or reality TV. The CRTC must also be able to regulate contractual practices between independent producers and programming companies, including in the music sector. This is a proposal from the Yale report that should be incorporated given the size of the players that will be subject to CRTC orders and regulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go to the Motion Picture Association of Canada. We have Ms. Noss and Mr. Lewis. I'm just looking for a hand to raise. Who's going to start first? Ms. Noss, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank
5 minutes,
you,
please.
Mr.
6
Chair.
minutes. 5 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Appreciate the offer to provide you with the shared perspective of the global studios represented by the Motion Picture Association in Canada. These include Walt Disney, Viacom, CBS, Paramount Pictures, Sony Pictures Entertainment, Netflix, NBC Universal, Universal Pictures, and Warner Brothers. All are major investors in Canada's creative economy through the production of television and streaming series, feature films, and world-class post-production visual effects and animation projects, employing over 94,000 Canadians a year and supporting over 23,000 Canadian businesses. Here with me today, albeit virtually, is John Lewis, who leads the IATSE in Canada. As IATSE is the largest union representing Canadian entertainment workers, costume and set designers, editors, cinematographers, visual effects artists, and virtually all of the crew, we both thought it would be useful to highlight that our major studios and this major labor organization
are aligned on why modern cultural policy must take into account opportunity for all Canadians who create film, television, and streaming entertainment in Canada, and the importance of foreign investment to Canada's creative sector. MPA members have for many years been partners and investors in Canada's creative community, and today they offer Canadian consumers diverse choices online. From the global entertainment on Netflix, the much-loved Disney brands on Disney+, the all-reality show hits of NBC Universal's Hey You, the ad-supported Pluto TV service from Viacom CBS, and their new Paramount Plus service, to the most popular Japanese anime streaming service in the Francophonie, Sony's Wakanim. It is with that broad perspective that we recognize a lot of good thinking went into the complex issues at the heart of Bill C-10. We want to commend the government for recognizing that a flexible approach is the logical way to create a modern broadcasting policy, given the rapidly and constantly changing dynamics in the marketplace. Global streaming services bring opportunities for Canadian creators, contribute to economic growth, and offer appealing entertainment for Canadian consumers. Allowing the CRTC to tailor conditions of service flexibly based on how best each of these services can or should contribute to Canada is a modern, sensible approach. To fully modernize broadcasting policy, we recommend 3 criteria be added to the factors that the CRTC must consider in future decision-making prescribed in Section 5 of the Act. Specifically, Parliament should require the CRTC to 1. Encourage competition and innovation. 2. Ensure that the regulation of online undertakings promotes choice and affordability for Canadian consumers. And 3. Recognizes that competition and the growing choice of programming made available online contributes to broadcasting policy objectives. By adding these criteria, the legislation will move beyond perpetuating decades-old broadcasting policy and create more choice for consumers and more opportunity for Canadian creators and film workers. Some argue that Bill C-10 should simply impose the same like-for-like obligations on online undertakings as Canadian broadcasters. This argument implies that nothing has changed in decades, from a time when the Broadcasting Act was designed to limit consumer choice. This approach ignores the many policy benefits that broadcasters have long enjoyed. It doesn't take into account the very different business models of streaming services, their content offerings, and it doesn't recognize the unique benefits that global studios bring to Canada through investment in production. While some are asking you to amend the bill to reduce flexibility, we believe the right way to serve Canada's creators, workers, and consumers is to develop a policy framework which embraces change and helps Canada benefit from it. Online undertakings create global entertainment, reflect a wide range of viewpoints and experiences, and this content is made in Canada with Canadian creatives. It is part of a global content marketplace that has led to foreign investment in production in Canada of over $4.8 billion annually. Almost 90% of the growth in production investment in Canada over the last 5 years, and more than half of all production in Canada comes from global studio investments fueled by these new undertakings. Talented Canadians who want to stay in Canada, develop their skills, work at the top of their craft, and help create stories that resonate with audiences around the world need this policy to be flexible and adaptive. Viewers who want the best stories from Canada and around the world need it to be forward-looking and consumer-friendly. A modern approach that promotes investment, competition, and innovation over protectionism will make for a bigger creative marketplace in Canada, more talent development opportunities for Canadian creators, more jobs for Canadian workers, and benefit Canadian consumers. Thank you for allowing us to share this perspective, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Noss. Now we go to Québécois Media. We have Mr. Palado and Madame Tabé. We get a show of hands. Who would like to speak first? Monsieur Palado, for 5 minutes.
For 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And members of Parliament, I'm Pierre-Carl Pelado, President and CEO of Québécois. With me is Peggy Tabé, Vice President of Public and Regulatory Affairs of Québécois. So Bill C-10 is a long-awaited overhaul of the Broadcasting Act. Since the Act was last updated in 1991, 30 years ago, the broadcasting landscape, is the least we can say, has changed dramatically and irreversibly with the appearance of foreign online streaming services such as Netflix, Disney Plus, and Amazon. Just for Amazon, it's to give you a perspective, Québecor had $8 billion market value. And in 2020, 68% of French-speaking Canadians were subscribed to an online streaming service. Globalized competition with web giants such as Facebook and Google destabilized our broadcasting system. And more than ever, traditional domestic players such as TVA and Videotron are facing unjustifiable and unsustainable inequities. When Bill C-10 was tabled, the Department of Canadian Heritage's presentation document promised, and I quote, to address regulatory asymmetries and provide flexibility and predictability. However, it is clear that the consequences resulting from the bill in its current form go against these objectives. For traditional broadcasters, those that showcase our Quebec and Francophone culture and the resulting economic benefits, the bill imposes new regulatory restrictions that will not redress the unfair conditions they have been coping with for years and will only pull them even deeper into the financial abyss and a Kafkaesque universe of regulation. From 2010 to 2019, the profits before interest and taxes of Canada's main private over-the-air television broadcasters plunged by a combined total of $223 million. And the decrease was even more drastic by 2020, totaling $336 million. The original intention of the legislator is certainly legitimate. It is to regulate television broadcasting, and as a corollary, the granting of a license and the holding of a privilege. Today, technology, and for many years now, has made it possible to broadcast without borders and without licenses. So trying to regulate what cannot be regulated is illusory. And that is why the bill should provide traditional players with the regulatory flexibility they need and lighten their administrative and financial burden by removing unnecessary obligations. To modernize the Broadcasting Act and make it fair for Canadian businesses, Québecor firmly believes regulation should be eased when market forces are operating effectively. Regulate only when necessary. Also, we cannot leave unmentioned a point that is notably absent from this bill, a refocused mandate for CBC Radio-Canada. Recently, the CRTC held public hearings on the renewal of CBC Radio-Canada's licenses. Over 70 industry stakeholders said the broadcaster has gone off track. And add to that all of the complaints filed with the CRTC on this issue, signed by over 16,000 people. Again, in that petition against the new branded content service, Tandem. CBC Radio-Canada's unbridled pursuit of ratings, its commercial ambitions, and its insatiable thirst for revenue are undeniably undermining the future and the sustainability of private broadcasters and the diversity of content. Each player in the system must play its role, and for this to happen, it is more important than ever that Parliament overhaul the public broadcaster's mandate. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, after a 30-year wait, the government is proposing to regulate foreign players instead of deregulating domestic broadcasters. We have serious reservations about the CRTC's ability to enforce these new regulations and restrict the behavior of foreign online services. If this new act is not to be totally ineffectual, Parliament must urgently amend its laws to allow the creation of a flexible ecosystem with fair regulations and taxation in order to keep our businesses viable and our culture strong. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Answers very quickly. I'm going to be a little strict on time, folks. I'm afraid to say, but Monsieur Reyes,
Mr. Reyes, for 6 minutes, please. Mr. Reyes?
we cannot hear you. There you go.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me now? That's good, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses who took the time to join us this afternoon. My first question will be for you, Mr. Pelado. In your conclusion, you said you have serious reservations about the CRTC's power or ability to carry out the new regulations under the modernized Bill C-10. Regarding web giants, remember that legislators originally wanted to decrease the regulatory burden on traditional broadcasters before even starting to regulate online broadcasters. How much would you have wanted regulatory easing? Can you give us more information? Well, there is a whole myriad of issues for television broadcasters and other broadcasters who have been seriously impacted, of course. These Canadian companies create jobs where Canadians go to work and very directly participate in creating Canadian content. So they participate in the funding of Canadian television. There was cord cutting, as was already mentioned, for cable companies because they are subject to regulations, including basic services, but no foreign companies are subjected to the same. This means the phenomenon of cord cutting is accelerated, and the consequence of that is that fuel is cut off to the Canada Media Fund, which helps to contribute funding to Canadian content. So in broadcasting, we are wondering how this can still be the case, but there are people who take a timer to determine the time that viewers, for example, applaud during a show to figure out whether or not there should be a tax credit or not. That is an environment that existed when it was possible to issue a license or accord a privilege, but that no longer exists. Now, the internet is a major player. And I was listening to Luc Perrault, who is a colleague who I esteem very highly, and he spoke to internet regulation. But how is the legislator going to legislate the internet to say what should be available or not? I mean, you could get into the criminal code, but that's another kettle of fish. So Netflix, Disney Plus, and the witness who spoke before me, Ms. Nuss, also referenced the scope and the size that broadcasters from the United States would take up, because most of them are from the United States, when it comes to online broadcasting, which we call streaming. We also do that. We are also making efforts. We have Club Illico, but Club Illico, as you already probably know, is already subject to tax, to HST and provincial Quebec tax, but online distributors were not. And we were told that this was all camouflaged under a Netflix tax. But I think the responsibility needs to be taken, because at the end of this exercise is the Canadian industry and Canadian culture, and particularly Quebec culture, that will pay the price. Mr. Pelado, can you give a simple answer? I would like to know what you think without elaborating necessarily. Do you think the CRTC is capable, will be capable of executing these new regulations for online distributors? Then I will have other questions. Well, I think I already answered in my prior response. I find it difficult to understand how the CRTC would be able to regulate the internet, because that is what this is about. Well, we were all astounded to see that the CRTC had public hearings, as you said, for CBC Radio-Canada. Right as we are studying Bill C-10, that mandate was questioned to see how it could be made more effective. You mentioned that in your speech. Can you give more details about how you think the government was responsible? How the government was irresponsible, rather. Well, they were playing ping pong. The Minister of Heritage said, we'll give that responsibility, that regulatory responsibility, to the CRTC. Then the CRTC puts the question to Radio-Canada, and then it turns out that it's the minister who's responsible. Then the Minister of Finance, because the Minister of Finance was responsible for Radio-Canada's budget. And then business practices, and I want to be very specific, these are business practices. It's not a question of culture. And more specifically, undermining private broadcasters whose major source of income is advertising. Well, we're looking at a company that is not responsible to the Heritage Department or to the CRTC. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pelado. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We just ran out of time there. Ms. Ian, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who've joined us today. Appreciate you joining us. Ms. Noss, I want to start with you. As you mentioned, most of your members are based in the United States, so interesting to have your perspective on this while you have so many Canadians working with you. You've stated that a flexible approach is the right approach. You've also said that people want choice. And you've asked that a walled garden approach not be replicated. What does that mean?
Well, I think it means you're building policy for the future here, and that policy needs to be predicated on the fact that these are not the same business models as broadcasters. They are not producing the same kinds of content. They do not have the same regulatory benefits, and that and they're not protected from competition in the same way. And so there have been witnesses who've come before you and said you should just impose the same obligations, same definitions on online services as Canadian broadcasters, and that simply makes no sense. As I said, the content strategies are different, the services are different, and the unique opportunities that foreign players can offer to young Canadian creators of, diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences, in a wide range of creative roles, and on a wide range of projects, working at the top of their class, getting training, and the ability to stay in Canada while they do that. So those are some of the kind of things that global studios can provide to Canadians, and it's just it's as I said, to the idea that you're just going to take 30-year-old broadcasting policy and attach that to a completely different business model at a completely different time in a completely different market just is not going to build opportunity for Canadian creators and consumers.
Ms. Noss, thank you so much. I want to move on to the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions now. As you mentioned, the Coalition is here on behalf of 43 associations and groups, more than 200,000 creators and professionals, 2,000 cultural organizations as well. I'm just wondering how severely, if you can characterize this for us, that the cultural sector has been impacted by the growing supply of online content. And Mr. Skolek, I'm fine with you.
Sure. Well, if you're talking about actual numbers, I don't have them at hand, but I can tell you that if you want to read the Globe and Mail 2 days ago, you can see what's happened to great people who would be classified as stars like Ashley McIsaac and Old Man Ludicky. It's been devastating. And it's been devastating because of COVID, but it started long before COVID. And the who knows when it will come back, if it will come back. And there's an opportunity with this act, with amendments to this act, to recreate production for all of these folks, to say we are going to take responsibility. We're going to provide the opportunity for our Canadians, our creators, and our performers and our producers to work within this system and to resurrect, to get rejuvenated. But the devastation that we hear from all of our organizations, it's incredible. You can read the stats in terms of the entertainment industry and the cultural industry, I think being hit harder than anybody, except perhaps hospitality and tourism. I'm not sure, but it's there. It's there. This is something that it just doesn't. If we bring them back, it's going to affect a lot of you folks there. You represent major festivals, even in the small towns. The Festival of the Sound, the Old Drummondville Folkloric Festival, the Victoriaville Festival, the Orford one, which is a famous festival. We even have a string quartet named after it. All these things can become rejuvenated. We need to take responsibility. We should not be embarrassed about saying we're going to help Canadian performers and creators and producers and publishers with all of this. That's something that we can do.
And with that in mind, how do we strike that middle ground? How do we strike that balance that you say is necessary?
Well, I think that the amendments that we're offering, I'm not going to go over them, do provide some opportunity to do that. I also think that having American production companies here, as Wendy has pointed out, the training that we receive and the experience that our people receive just result in an even better product from Canadians happening. So these things are not mutually exclusive. You don't have to say one and not the other. Just have to make sure that there's a level playing field, that people are treated the same, and all of their experiences are noted when policy is made. But like I said in my comments, this isn't the case of just like massaging regulations. It's a case of saying, and not being embarrassed about saying, we're here with this act to make sure that Canadian culture is there front and center, and it's there all the time. Our stories, our folks, our performers, our producers. They get it in Quebec. I just hope the rest of the country can pick it up from there too.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ian. We have to call it with that.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Champoux, pour
Mr. Champoux, for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us. I'll start with a question for Ms. Gay from the Coalition. The minister was at the ADISC speaking about Bill C-10 and how it's a cultural bill. Yesterday, we had a look at the directive from the government to the CRTC. How did you react to those directives when you saw them yesterday? Well, as you said, that happened yesterday, so we will certainly meet with our members to discuss it, but I have already spoken to a number of them, so I can tell you that they're extremely disappointed by this approach that seems more like a market law instead of a cultural law, which it should be. So deregulation of the sector is a concern. We've been saying this since August, and we have been meeting more and more frequently, and we have been trying to have our voice heard as much as possible. If our amendments are accepted, then that would be favorable for our objectives. And on your amendments, I know you mentioned protecting original Francophone content, and also original Canadian content, which also concerns me. And you proposed 3 amendments for C-10. In your opinion, what would the consequences be if those amendments you proposed were not accepted? Thank you for the question. Well, we would be concerned that if the bill weren't strengthened, we will end up with more content that's either translated into French or subtitled in French. But we think it's important to reinforce the bill on original French language content. Many organizations, a number of our members in 2017 were involved when the CRTC looked back at Francophone content. There were not provisions made for original French language content, so that needs to be added now. So in the first amendment, we proposed that OLMCs be named. And then in our second amendment, we say that there should be oversight of Canadian content in both official languages and in Indigenous languages. I'll let you go ahead in case you're going to ask another question. Well, it's because we don't have much time. We could speak to this for hours, but I have questions for Québécois as well. So if I may, Mr. Pellado, I have a question for you, because you've often mentioned that traditional Canadian broadcasters have regulatory obligations that are very heavy. Could you give us a few examples of those obligations that could be foregone? Yes, it would be my pleasure. It could seem fastidious, these obligations, but I have the list here in front of me and I'll read it to you. So broadcasting quotas, for example, TVA needs to have 50% of Canadian content in the evenings. Spending obligations for national interest programming, obligations for independent production, obligations for local production, that news reflect the local reality. There's an obligation on descriptive video and subtitling. There's regulation of basic service at $25. There are obligations related to APTN. And there are obligations for reports, yearly reports, reports regarding property, programming register, and cultural content. So as you can see, instead of investing in Quebec and Canadian production, we're investing in paperwork and bureaucracy. So our foreign competitors have no obligation in the meantime. And earlier, I heard Ms. Gay speak, and we have always far exceeded the levels for investment. However, we do have the obligation to always fulfill that administrative burden. We broadcast and we create jobs for artists and for stakeholders in the broadcasting and cultural sector for a simple reason. It's because those are our viewers. The viewers have expectations, and God knows that Quebec has talent. So we do it to put that on the screen, and that's what we've done long before Québécois purchased TVA. So this is natural, historic momentum that we saw in Quebec, and it's not regulations that forced us to create Canadian content, invest in Canadian content. Thank you very much.
We go to the NDP. Ms. McPherson, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for all of our witnesses for joining us today. This is very interesting. One of the witnesses we haven't heard too much from is Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis, I'm curious as to why IATSE wanted to be here. Can you speak to that, please?
Oh, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to speak today and ensure that the voice of the majority of film and television workers is heard, and that's why I am here today. The IA is the largest union in the entertainment industry, representing over 150,000 creatives across North America, including 30,000 in Canada. We are the behind the scenes creatives such as cinematographers, costume designers, scenic artists, makeup artists, and special effects technicians. We must address changes to the Broadcast Act from a sense of confidence and optimism. Our industry is booming. We are thriving not because of content quotas and regulatory restrictions, but because we are good. Our infrastructure is world-class, and our creative talent is world-class. Even in the face of the global pandemic, our film and television industry has burst back to match historic highs, which would not have been possible without serious deliberation and cooperation to ensure cast and crew are safe when working. The IA supports the need for a flexible approach to create a modern broadcast policy and allowing the CRTC to use its expertise to fashion appropriate mechanisms to support the entire industry. Because at the end of the day, a healthy industry requires a thriving domestic and foreign sector. They complement each other. They don't compete with each other. We are not opposed to foreign streamers contributing to the domestic industry. We believe they should. But when determining that contribution, we would ask this committee to consider the full scope of their contributions. Foreign streamers make direct investments in producing content in Canada. As recently reported, since 2017, Netflix alone has spent $2.5 billion, employing Canadian creative talent. That is tens of thousands of Canadian jobs. In 2018-2019, the foreign service industry was the largest single component of productions employing Canadian creative talent, which my organization represents. And I'm disappointed to hear some commentators complain that foreign service productions do not employ Canadian talent. Really? The vast majority of creative positions on foreign service productions are Canadian. And to suggest otherwise is not supported by the facts. Even worse, it suggests the work of the talented Canadians on Star Trek in Toronto or Deadpool in Vancouver or the X-Men in Montreal are not as important and should somehow be discounted. I call that cultural elitism, and it should not inform our policy decisions. And we also hear a lot about the importance of supporting Canadian stories. And Canadian stories should not be used interchangeably with Canadian content. Just because something qualifies as Canadian content does not make it a Canadian story. When a Hallmark movie sets up as a small US town, it qualifies Canadian, but The Handmaid's Tale or Barkskins in Quebec City did not. We have to rethink the definition of what constitutes a Canadian production. And we are pleased that the proposed act contemplates that the CRTC modernize the definition of Canadian content. Our 10-point system is badly outdated and in need of an overhaul. And we also support enhancing the discoverability of Canadian productions on streaming services. So if I could leave with one note of concern from the workers in this industry, it would be do no harm. And if I could, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Department of Heritage for their incredible work to support cultural workers during the pandemic. The IA also represents workers in the live performance industry, and the actions of the federal government has made a difference for thousands of families who have seen their livelihood decimated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I have just one quick follow-up question for you. So I appreciate your perspective. I think it's important that we do get that perspective from workers. Some of the other concerns that we'd had raised, though, that sort of align with this were from the Writers Guild of Canada, where they spoke about Canadian writers not being used and making sure that those are incorporated into our productions. Do you have any comment to make on that?
Like I said, I think a healthy, thriving industry requires both a strong domestic industry and a foreign sector industry. But if I could, years ago when a lot of US productions first started coming to Canada, they had a higher percentage of US crews coming up and working on those productions. And over time, the amount of US crews coming to Canada was greatly reduced. We saw greater training ability. We saw opportunities that would otherwise not exist for Canadian talent. And I would say the same takes place in the writing room as well. I think it's a tougher battle for the writing room, but one that can be overcome. And again, the flexibility, allowing the CRTC to deal with these issues can address those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, we have about 8 or 9 minutes left. If I could ask you for a favor, we're going to go into second round. And I say that because I like doing that, but also because we've asked these guests to come back after we scheduled them several weeks ago and canceled at the last minute for reasons of democracy. So can I ask each of my colleagues to please think of about 1 or 2 questions and try to throw some of that time back to me, because I don't want to do just 1 or 2 parties and then cut it off. I'd like to include all 4 parties. I think that's only fair as colleagues. So can I ask you to be as concise as possible? I will afford the time that is necessary, of course, but hopefully you can help me out. Okay, let's go to Mr. Aitchison. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have I think actually a fairly quick question for Mr. Pelledo. I'm hearing over and over again people talking about the difficulties that Canadian broadcasters face, in part because of regulation, and then also because of new streaming content, for example, coming on and not being subject to the same regulation. I tend to agree with your point that easing regulation on traditional broadcasters would be a better approach. Would you describe the approach of Bill C-10, which, for lack of any real thoughtful analysis of the situation, simply calls streamers broadcasters, is kind of a lazy approach to solving the problem?
Yes, well, I understand that the lawmaker is supposed to regulate. The issue here is, again, and this is not something against American companies that are providing and streaming content to Canadian public. It's about making sure that the Canadian broadcasters and all of the stakeholders of the industry will be able to continue to compete in a brand new world, in a world where you do not need a license anymore to broadcast, which is what is taking place. And therefore, I think that the broadcasters understand very well that their competitive advantages would be that they are Canadian and they have this sensibility, they have the knowledge of what the Canadian public is looking for. It doesn't mean that, Canadian doesn't want to watch The Crown on Netflix, but it means also for Canadian broadcasters that there's some specific stories in Quebec and then the rest of Canada to make sure, and those broadcasters knows this, and then therefore they will address the requirements or the needs of the Canadian population. But if we have over-regulation on top of the purpose of investing at the right place, obviously we're not doing the right thing.
Thank you very much for that. I don't need to go on. I think that's good for me. If you want to move on to the next person, Mr. Chair, I know you're running out of time.
That's very generous, and as we say in Newfoundland and Labrador, God love your heart and soul, sir. All right, let's go to Mr. Tim Lewis, MP, for the next round of questioning. Thank you.
Chair, thank you for helping me learn a new phrase. I will also shorten my time so as everyone gets a chance. I appreciate everyone's time. This has been extremely helpful. I know Mr. Skolnick mentioned creators and performers in our culture industry. You use the word devastated, and I could not agree more. Digital content more and more is becoming demonetized. For so many consumers, music has become practically free. Writing is becoming free. Obtaining video is free practically, and images are practically free. So, and we all know that creating art and creating music, those stories, it takes years of dedication. So that requires a means of support. And if things are going to change, a lot of our art is going to basically cease to be sustainable. So because of the pandemic, artists are not able to work and perform in congregate settings. And by one of my definitions, art brings people together. And so therefore we really do need to support creativity more than ever. So I very much appreciate, Mrs. Skolnick, your passion in this. And I also appreciate in your pre-study, you mentioned that our pre-study was important to move things forward in an expedited manner. And so I'll get right to the amendments. I'll only talk about one today. The one that amendment that you were concerned that it might reduce the requirement to use Canadian talent. And you say it could result in broadcast undertaking no longer having an obligation to use Canadian talent. So how can we enshrine that idea that we want to maintain Canadian content? And I know you used Sirius as an example.
First of all, just an aside, you have in your town center in the square, which is one of the great halls in the country. For those of you who don't know, and it is a perfect example of where to go to get great acoustics and to record. By the way,
I've gigged on that stage, so yes.
Good. So have I. Anyway, the idea again, and I actually want to refer back to Wendy and to John. This, and I use this phrase: it's not mutually exclusive. Okay, helping one does not take away from the other, so that we need to take advantage of the fact that we can enhance our own folks with our own talent. We're worried that the regulations will be lowered to the lowest common denominator. That we need to say, okay, you can do this, but if you want to get these benefits, you have to use Canadians, and you have to use them all the way through. The market is going to look after a lot of it. You got to sell it no matter whether it's Canadian or not. But we believe, just like we do with so many regulations in this country, that Canadians must be put forward. Canadians must be part of it. And our amendment concerns that to ensure that all aspects consider Canadians, and not just the regular ones too. But we know that, for example, in other jurisdictions, Disney Channel is obligated, excuse me, to have local content, for example, in Latin America. To us, this is not something that is detrimental. This is something that is promotional and something that we need to continually promote and support.
Thank you all. I will cede my time so as everyone else gets a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Monsieur Champoux.
Mr. Champoux. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If everyone is so generous with their time, maybe we can have a third round of questions. I'd like to ask a question to Ms. Gay. Ms. Gay, do you believe it's possible to meet all of the requests of all industry stakeholders, so Canadian broadcasters, online platforms, internet, and foreign companies, and cultural industry players? Do you think it's possible to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone, like in a bill like C10? Well, is there a magic solution that will satisfy all stakeholders who don't have the same interests? Well, that's quite a big question. I'm not sure if it's the right question, if I may be so bold. I think the government has a responsibility to take the right decision for its cultural sovereignty. I think that the landscape has evolved. Many witnesses have already highlighted that. But that doesn't mean that cultural projects are no longer valuable today. I think that there are new players, there are emerging interfaces, and I think that they should pay their share and play their part. And I think that many players will be able to agree, but I think what's important is to make the right decisions now for our cultural sovereignty and for the future of it. Mr. Pelado, I'd like to ask you a similar question. You wanted for obligations for traditional broadcasters to be eased, but in the same breath you said it would be difficult for the CRTC to regulate the internet regarding web giants. According to your logic, do you believe that it would be possible to satisfy everyone without the cultural industry suffering? My opinion might be less contradictory than it seemed. Perhaps some players would be better served with a reduction of regulations, because regulations could accelerate the elimination of certain players that might never have been capable of being competitive. At the end of the day, it's a matter of money. I think Mr. Skolnick's comment was interesting when he said that Disney in North America was able to regulate content. So yes, that could be perhaps done in a regulated environment. Thank you. But today we can't do that anymore. Thank you very much, sir.
I'll be very quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question actually for Ms. Gay. You know, I'm also very, very concerned about the results, the impacts of what will happen if we don't get this right, if we don't get this very delicate balance correct within this bill. You spoke about cultural sovereignty. You spoke about the need to avoid a race to the bottom. I'd just like you to give you the final word. Can you talk about what we need to do again to prevent the race to the bottom, to ensure our cultural sovereignty, to ensure that we hit the balance that we need to hit correctly?
Yes, thank you for your question. Like, I mean, it's true, and some broadcasters today, and Mr. Pelado said it many times. They are asking their conditions be reduced so they can compete better. And in a sense, they are right that the conditions are unfair to them at present, but what we propose is that online undertakings have to meet the same level of conditions rather than reducing the existing conditions. So if we lower the conditions for everyone, it is our artists, creators, and local production companies who will pay the price, losing their jobs and contracts, and along with the Canadian public, who will no longer have access to our great Canadian productions and will have access to less diversity. And the economy will also pay the price, because broadcasters will pay foreign production or other type of production that will not bring added value to our economy. And another important aspect is the inability of our producers to hold copyright to their productions and thus market them internationally. So if the exhibitors, both conventional and digital, hold all rights, producers will have no back end. This speaks to the ability of the CRTC to bring back the notion of terms of trade, which is another one of our recommendations.
Thank you, and that's a good place for us to end, Mr. Chair.
It most certainly is, McPherson. Ms. McPherson, thank you very much. Okay, folks, I want to say thank you to my colleagues for helping me out on that second round. I'm glad we got through it for reasons that are quite evident. I thought our witnesses today were great, and I'm glad we rescheduled. As a committee, we took the decision to reschedule after you were canceled on that day. You were all great. I really enjoyed what you had to say from the Coalition for the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. Ms. Gay, Mr. Skolnick, thank you. From the Motion Picture Association of Canada, Ms. Naz, and from the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, Mr. Lewis. Also from Québecor, Madame Tabé, and last but by no means least, Mr. Palado. Always enjoyed your input, sir. Thanks for joining us. Okay, folks, we're going to have to break for a bit and go into cameras. And again, I thank our witnesses for joining us. Oh, and just a reminder, you have to log in with your new coordinates for in-camera. Thank you very much.
you.